glass-walled office on the 42nd floor, staring at the contract that would end everything he'd spent 15 years building. His hands trembled as he held the pen. 5,000 pounds. That's all it cost to destroy a man's entire career. Not a bullet, not a scandal, just a signature on a piece of paper he never should have trusted. And in exactly 48 hours, the world would know his name for all the wrong reasons. Before we dive into how one decision unraveled everything Williams had worked for, I need you to do something right now. Type your country in the comments below. Let me know where you're watching from. And if you want more true stories that will keep you awake at night, hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone who needs to hear this. Because what happened to Williams could happen to anyone. Now let's go back to where it all began. Williams wasn't born into privilege. He grew up in a 2-bedroom flat in Manchester, where the heating barely worked and his mother worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. He remembered nights when she'd come home at midnight, her hands raw from cleaning offices, and still find the energy to ask about his homework. She had one dream for him: get out, build something better, make a name that meant something. And Williams took that dream and turned it into an obsession. By the time he was 16, Williams was already different. While other kids were hanging around street corners, he was in the library, devouring books on business, finance, and psychology. He didn't just want success. He wanted to understand the architecture of it. How did some people rise while others stayed trapped? What separated the winners from everyone else? He filled notebooks with observations, strategies, ideas that seemed almost manic in their detail. His teachers noticed. Some encouraged him. Others thought he was wasting his time dreaming too big for a kid from his background. But Williams had something most people don't have. Not talent, not connections. He had hunger. The kind that burns in your chest when you wake up at 4 in the morning and can't go back to sleep because you're thinking about everything you don't have yet. The kind that makes you work when everyone else is resting. The kind that makes you willing to do almost anything to prove you're not going to end up like the broken men you see on your street, their dreams long dead in their eyes. He got into university on a partial scholarship. Not Oxford, not Cambridge, a mid-tier school that nobody's parents bragged about. But Williams didn't care about the name on the degree. He cared about what he could learn and who he could meet. He studied economics and finance, pulling all-nighters not because he had to, but because he genuinely wanted to master every concept. While his classmates were at parties, Williams was networking. He showed up at every career fair, every guest lecture, every alumni event. He learned people's names. He asked questions that made them remember him. He was building something, brick by brick, connection by connection, and it worked. By his final year, Williams had landed an internship at a boutique investment firm in London. It wasn't Goldman Sachs, but it was a foot in the door. He moved to London with 2 suitcases and an air mattress, sleeping on the floor of a cramped flat he shared with 4 other people. The commute was 90 minutes each way. He didn't care. Every morning he'd put on his one good suit, the one his mother had scraped together money to buy him, and he'd walk into that office like he owned the place. The partners noticed. Williams had an ability to see patterns in financial data that others missed. He could look at a company's quarterly reports and predict market movements with unsettling accuracy. But more than that, he had presence. When Williams spoke in meetings, people listened. He had taught himself to be confident without being arrogant, assertive without being aggressive. He was the guy who could pitch to nervous clients and make them feel like everything was going to be fine. "Trust me," he'd say, and somehow they did. Within 2 years, Williams wasn't an intern anymore. He was an associate, then a senior associate. Then, at just 28 years old, he made partner, the youngest in the firm's history. He moved into a modern apartment in Canary Wharf with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Thames. He bought his mother a house. He drove a car that cost more than his childhood home. He wore watches that cost more than his first-year salary. And every time someone from his old neighborhood saw him, they'd shake their head in amazement. Williams made it. Williams got out. But here's what nobody tells you about success. The higher you climb, the thinner the air gets. And the more you have, the more you're terrified of losing it. Williams started to feel it around year 5 of being a partner. The pressure wasn't just about performing anymore. It was about staying ahead of younger, hungrier versions of himself. Every quarter there was someone new trying to prove they could do what he did, but better. Every client meeting felt like a test he had to pass again. The firm was doing well, but the market was changing. Fintech startups were disrupting traditional models. Clients were asking harder questions. Competition was brutal. Williams started working longer hours, 70, 80, sometimes 90 hours a week. He was always on his phone, always available, always chasing the next deal. His relationships suffered. He went through two serious relationships that ended the same way. She'd tell him he was married to his work, and he couldn't even argue because it was true. He'd promised to change, to make more time, but within a week he'd be back to the same patterns. Because in Williams's mind, there was no such thing as enough. Every achievement just moved the goalpost further. Then came the opportunity, or at least that's what it looked like at first. Williams was approached by a man named Richard Barrow. Richard was a consultant, one of those smooth-talking types who always seemed to be connected to people in high places. He'd helped several firms optimize their operations, streamline their processes, expand their client base. He had testimonials, case studies, a website that looked professional, and he had a proposition for Williams. They met at an upscale restaurant in Mayfair. Richard wore a tailored suit and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He ordered expensive wine and talked about opportunity. He told Williams he'd been watching his career, impressed by his trajectory, and believed Williams had the potential to go even higher. But to get there, Williams needed to think bigger. The firm he was at was good, Richard said, but it was limiting, regional, safe. Williams had the skills to go global, to build something of his own, to stop making other people rich and start building his own empire. Williams listened. Part of him was flattered, part of him was skeptical, but the biggest part, the part that always won, was ambitious. Richard laid out a plan. He ran a consulting service that helped high-performing executives transition from corporate roles into entrepreneurship. He'd help Williams develop a business plan, connect him with investors, set up the infrastructure, navigate the legal complexities, everything Williams would need to launch his own investment advisory firm. The cost? £5,000, a consulting fee that Richard said was a fraction of what he usually charged, but he believed in Williams and wanted to invest in his success. £5,000 for a 12-month consulting package that included strategy sessions, investor introductions, legal templates, marketing support, and ongoing mentorship. Richard slid a folder across the table. Inside was a contract, professionally formatted, filled with impressive-sounding terms and deliverables. Williams should have walked away. Every instinct he'd honed over years of reading contracts should have told him something was off. The fee was too low for what was being promised. Richard was too eager, too flattering. And the contract, when Williams actually read it carefully later, was filled with vague language about advisory services and best effort support with no concrete guarantees. But Williams didn't walk away. Because Richard had said the magic words, "You're better than where you are. You deserve more. You could be building your own legacy." Williams signed the contract that night. He transferred £5,000 the next morning, and Richard disappeared within a week. Not completely, that would have been too obvious. He became unavailable. Emails went unanswered for days, then weeks. Phone calls went to voicemail. The promised strategy sessions never materialized. The investor introductions never happened. When Williams finally managed to get Richard on the phone, there was always an excuse: a family emergency, a scheduling conflict. He was traveling. He was dealing with another client's urgent matter. Soon, Williams would get everything he'd paid for. But weeks turned into months, and Williams started to realize what had happened. He'd been scammed, not by some obvious criminal, but by someone who'd built an entire persona around looking legitimate. The testimonials on Richard's website? Fake. The case studies? Fabricated. Even the office address Richard had listed turned out to be a virtual office service. Williams had been so focused on the dream Richard was selling that he'd failed to do the basic due diligence he would have done for any business deal. £5,000 wasn't going to bankrupt Williams. That wasn't the problem. The problem was what he'd done next, because Williams, in his excitement and his arrogance, had told people about his plan. He told his partners at the firm that he was considering leaving to start his own venture. He'd mentioned it to key clients, testing the waters to see if they'd follow him. He'd even done a preliminary interview with a business journalist who was working on a profile about rising stars in London's finance scene. Williams had positioned himself as someone on the cusp of something bigger, and now he had nothing. No consulting support, no business plan, no investor connections. Just a stupid decision and a paper trail of his own hubris. Williams could have kept quiet, could have written off the loss, canceled his plans, and stayed at the firm. But his partners had already started treating him differently. Once he'd expressed interest in leaving, the dynamic had changed. They started excluding him from major decisions. Clients he'd brought in were being reassigned. The message was clear. If you're not committed to being here, we're not committed to you. Williams tried to salvage things. He reached out to Richard again, this time through a lawyer, demanding either services or a refund. Richard's response came through his own lawyer, pointing to clauses in the contract Williams had signed. The agreement stated that payment was non-refundable, that services would be provided over time as appropriate, that Richard maintained sole discretion over timing and methodology. The contract Williams had signed in his eagerness was legally airtight. Richard had done this before. Williams was just another mark. The breakdown happened slowly, then all at once. Williams started missing deadlines at work. His concentration was shot. He'd sit in client meetings and realize he hadn't heard a word anyone said for the past 10 minutes. He stopped sleeping properly. He'd lie awake at 3 in the morning, replaying the restaurant meeting with Richard, seeing all the red flags he'd ignored, hating himself for being so stupid. The man who'd built his reputation on careful analysis and strategic thinking had been played like an amateur. His performance reviews went from excellent to concerning. His partners called him in for a conversation. They were worried about him, they said. They'd noticed the change. Was everything all right? And Williams wanted to tell them everything. Wanted to explain that he'd made a mistake, that he'd been scammed, that he was dealing with it. But he knew how it would sound. Williams, the golden boy, the youngest partner, the guy who was supposed to have it all figured out, had fallen for a basic con. It would destroy his credibility. So instead, he lied. He said he was fine, just tired, just stressed. He'd get it together, but he didn't get it together. The journalist's profile came out. It mentioned Williams's plans to launch his own firm, painting him as an ambitious visionary, ready to disrupt the industry. Except now Williams had no firm to launch. The article made him look foolish and arrogant. Competitors started circling. Former colleagues started whispering. Social media posts about the article attracted comments from people who knew Richard, who'd also been scammed, who were warning others. Williams's name started appearing in threads about financial fraud victims. His reputation, the thing he'd spent 15 years building, was unraveling in real time. The firm made the decision for him. They called it a mutual separation, said it was time for Williams to pursue other opportunities, offered him a severance package in exchange for his silence and a non-compete agreement. Williams was being pushed out of the company he'd helped build, and there was nothing he could do about it. He cleaned out his desk on a Friday afternoon. His assistant wouldn't make eye contact. The other partners shook his hand with the kind of forced sympathy people offer at funerals. Williams spent the next 6 months in a haze. He still had money saved, but his identity had been tied to his work. Without it, he didn't know who he was. He stopped returning calls from friends. He avoided his mother because he couldn't stand the disappointment he knew he'd see in her eyes. He'd scroll through LinkedIn and see his former colleagues getting promoted, closing deals, living the life he'd been forced out of, and all of it traced back to one decision, 5,000 pounds, one signature, one moment of believing he was smarter than he actually was. Depression isn't always obvious. Sometimes it's just a flatness, a sense that nothing matters. Williams would wake up with no reason to get out of bed. He'd spend hours doing nothing, just staring at his phone or the television without actually absorbing anything. Food tasted like nothing. Conversations felt exhausting. He started drinking more than he should, not because he enjoyed it, but because it made the thoughts quieter. He gained weight. He stopped exercising. He stopped caring about how he looked. The man who'd once taken pride in his appearance now went days without showering. His savings started to run low. The apartment he'd been so proud of felt like a prison. He couldn't afford it anymore. Not without income. Not with his severance running out. He moved into a smaller place, then an even smaller one. Each downgrade felt like another confirmation that he was falling, and he couldn't stop it. People from his old life stopped reaching out. At first, they'd sent messages checking in, but Williams never responded, and eventually they stopped trying. It's amazing how quickly you can become invisible once you're no longer successful. Then something shifted. Williams hit bottom so hard that he had a choice: stay there or do something about it. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday. He was sitting in his studio apartment, unshowered, wearing the same clothes he'd worn for 3 days, contemplating whether life was even worth continuing. And his phone buzzed. It was a message from someone he didn't know, someone who'd found him through the journalist article. The message said, "I was scammed by Richard Barrow too. I thought I was the only one. Thank you for being public about it." Williams stared at that message for a long time. He wasn't the only one. Richard had done this to other people. And something in Williams woke up. Not the old Williams, the one who'd been obsessed with success and status. A different version. One who'd been broken down enough to build something new. He started responding to messages from other victims. There were dozens of them. People from all over the UK, some from Europe, all with the same story. Richard's polished pitch. The professional-looking contract. The £5,000 fee. The disappearing act. Williams created a group chat, then a Facebook group, then a proper organization. He called it Advisory Fraud Awareness Network. He used his finance background to help other victims document their cases. He reached out to journalists, regulators, law enforcement. He became obsessed again, but this time the obsession wasn't about building his own success. It was about stopping Richard and people like him from destroying anyone else. The work was hard and mostly thankless. Law enforcement was slow. Richard operated in legal gray areas that made prosecution difficult. But Williams didn't stop. He built a database of Richard's victims. He created resources to help people identify consulting scams. He started speaking at universities and professional organizations about due diligence and the psychology of fraud. He wasn't making money doing this. He took a job at a small nonprofit focused on consumer protection, making a fraction of what he used to earn. But for the first time in years, Williams felt like he was doing something that mattered. The breakthrough came 18 months after Williams had signed that contract. One of the victims in his network was the investigative journalist who'd been scammed early in her career. She'd been quietly building a case against Richard, documenting his patterns, tracking his fake identities, connecting the dots. And when she published her expose, it went viral. Major news outlets picked it up. Regulatory bodies launched investigations. Richard's entire operation collapsed within weeks. He was arrested, charged with multiple counts of fraud, and eventually convicted. Williams was asked to give a victim impact statement at the sentencing hearing. He stood in that courtroom and looked at Richard, the man who'd cost him £5,000 and nearly cost him everything else. And Williams didn't feel angry anymore. He felt something closer to pity, because Richard was a small man with a small con, and he'd be spending the next several years in prison while Williams had already moved on. Williams told the court about what he'd lost, but also about what he'd gained: the clarity, the purpose, the understanding that success isn't about how high you climb, but about what you do when you fall. The judge sentenced Richard to 6 years. Williams never got his £5,000 back. The money was long gone, spent on Richard's lifestyle, his fake offices, his carefully constructed persona. But Williams didn't care about the money anymore. He'd spent that year and a half helping over 200 people avoid similar scams. He'd influenced policy changes in how consulting services were regulated. He'd built something real out of his worst mistake. Williams rebuilt his career, slowly and carefully, not in high finance. That door was closed, and he didn't want to open it again anyway. He became a consultant himself, but the legitimate kind. He helped small businesses and startups with financial strategy, charging fair rates and delivering actual value. He wrote a book about his experience called The £5,000 Lesson. It became a bestseller in the UK. He started getting invited to speak at conferences. Universities wanted him to lecture. His life looked nothing like it had at the peak of his finance career, but it was more authentic, more meaningful. His mother read the book. She called him crying, not because of what he'd lost, but because of what he'd become. She told him she was prouder of him now than she'd ever been when he was making six figures and driving expensive cars. Because now she recognized her son again, the one who cared about people, the one who worked hard not just for himself but to help others. Williams had spent years chasing a version of success that looked good from the outside, and it had taken losing everything to realize that version was hollow. Williams is 42 now. He lives in a modest flat in Bristol. He's married to a woman he met at a community event, a social worker who reminds him constantly what actually matters. They don't have much money, not compared to his old life, but they have enough. Williams still works long hours sometimes, but now it's because he's passionate about a project, not because he's trying to prove something. He mentors young professionals, warning them about the traps he fell into: the ego, the desperation to succeed at any cost, the vulnerability that comes with wanting something so badly you stop thinking clearly. People sometimes ask Williams if he regrets signing that contract. If he could go back and change that one decision, would he? And Williams always pauses before answering because the truth is complicated. Of course he wishes he hadn't been scammed. Of course he wishes he hadn't lost his career, his reputation, his sense of self. But if he hadn't signed that contract, he'd probably still be that person. The one who worked 90-hour weeks chasing deals that didn't matter. The one who measured his worth in pounds and status. The one who was successful on paper but empty inside. That 5,000 pounds taught Williams what 15 years of success never could. It taught him that failure isn't the end of your story unless you let it be. It taught him that rock bottom is sometimes the foundation you need to build something better. It taught him that the most important thing you can protect isn't your money or your reputation, but your integrity and your purpose. It taught him that being broken doesn't mean you're finished. Sometimes it means you're being rebuilt into something stronger. Williams keeps a copy of that contract in his desk drawer, not to torture himself, but as a reminder. On days when he's frustrated or feeling like he's not doing enough, he looks at it and remembers where he's been. He remembers the man who stood in that glass office, hands shaking, about to destroy everything, and he's grateful he's not that man anymore. That version of Williams was successful, but small. This version, the one who's been broken and rebuilt, is actually free. The scars are still there. Williams still has moments where he sees someone from his old life and feels that flash of shame. He still sometimes wakes up in the middle of the night replaying that restaurant meeting, seeing all the red flags he missed. But those moments are less frequent now. And when they come, Williams has learned to sit with them, to acknowledge them, and then to let them go. Because dwelling on what you can't change is just another prison. And Williams has already served his time. He thinks about Richard sometimes too, not with hatred, but with a strange kind of understanding. Richard was also chasing something he thought would make him whole: money, power, the ability to manipulate people and get away with it. And where did it get him? 6 years in prison and a permanent mark on his record. Richard thought he was winning when he took Williams' money. But in the end, Williams got the better deal. He got humility. He got purpose. He got a second chance to build a life that actually meant something. The people Williams helps now remind him why the journey was worth it. The young professional who almost signed a similar contract but didn't because of Williams's work. The small business owner who avoided a fraudulent consultant because they recognized the warning signs. The university student who heard Williams speak and decided to prioritize integrity over shortcuts. Each of these people represents someone who didn't have to learn the hard way, someone who benefited from Williams's pain, and that turns the loss into something valuable. Williams still gives talks, still writes, still consults, but his favorite work is the quiet stuff, the one-on-one conversations with people who are where he was, ambitious, hungry, terrified of failure, willing to cut corners to succeed. He tells them his story, all of it, including the parts that make him look foolish, and he watches something shift in their eyes. recognition, understanding, relief that they're not the only ones who've struggled. Permission to be human instead of perfect. There's a saying Williams uses to close his talks. I paid £5,000 to have my career destroyed. Best money I never got back. People always laugh, but then they get quiet because they understand what he means. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is actually the best thing. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to figure out what actually matters. Sometimes destruction is just preparation for reconstruction. William's story isn't a traditional success story. He didn't bounce back bigger and better. He didn't make millions or achieve some triumphant comeback. Instead, he built something quieter and more sustainable. A life based on values instead of validation. A career focused on contribution instead of accumulation. A sense of self that doesn't collapse the moment things go wrong. That's not the kind of success that makes headlines, but it's the kind that actually lasts. The real tragedy wouldn't have been signing that contract. The real tragedy would have been staying bitter, staying stuck, letting that one mistake define the rest of his life. Williams could have done that, could have spent decades nursing his resentment, blaming Richard, playing the victim. Some people do. Some people take a betrayal or a failure and build their entire identity around it. But Williams chose differently. He chose to extract the lesson, do the work, and rebuild. Not into who he was before, but into someone better. Now, when Williams looks back at that moment in the glass office, holding that pen, he doesn't see it as the day his career ended. He sees it as the day his real life began, because everything before that was performance, playing a role, trying to become someone impressive, and everything after has been about becoming someone real, someone who's failed and learned, someone who's been broken and healed, someone who knows that the most valuable things you own are the lessons you've learned and the people you've helped. Williams still has ambitions. He wants to expand his fraud awareness work. He wants to write another book. He wants to help more people avoid the mistakes he made. But the ambitions feel different now. They're not about proving anything to anyone. They're not about filling some void inside him. They're about using what he's learned to make things better. And that's a kind of success that no one can take away. £5,000, one signature. A career destroyed, a life rebuilt. That's William's story. Not a cautionary tale about avoiding scams, though it is that. Not a redemption arc about overcoming adversity, though it is that too. It's a story about what happens when you stop measuring your worth by external markers and start measuring it by internal ones. When you stop performing success and start living integrity. When you stop trying to impress people who don't matter and start focusing on helping people who do. Williams would tell you he's not special, that anyone could do what he did, that the only difference between people who recover from failure and people who don't is the decision to keep going, to extract meaning from pain, to refuse to let the worst moment define all the moments that come after. He'd tell you that he's still figuring it out, still making mistakes, still learning. But he'd also tell you that he's happier now than he ever was in that glass office, that he sleeps better, that he looks in the mirror and recognizes the person looking back. The contract that destroyed Williams's career is still in his desk drawer. Sometimes he shows it to people, points out all the red flags he missed, uses it as a teaching tool, and every time he looks at it, he feels something unexpected, not regret, not shame, something closer to gratitude. Because that piece of paper, that terrible decision, that £5,000, it set him free. Free from the prison of his own ambition, free from the exhausting work of pretending to be invincible, free to be human, flawed, and real. That's the ending most people don't expect. They want Williams to have gotten rich or famous, or to have completely destroyed Richard in some dramatic way. But real life isn't that neat. Real redemption isn't about revenge or vindication. It's about internal transformation. It's about becoming someone who can survive their own worst decisions and come out the other side with more wisdom than bitterness. It's about turning pain into purpose and mistakes into meaning. Williams is living proof that you can lose everything that you thought defined you and discover that you're still someone worth being, that your value isn't in your job title or your bank account or your reputation, That who you are is what you do when everything else is stripped away. And what Williams did when he was stripped down to nothing was choose to rebuild with integrity, to help others, to share his story not for sympathy, but for prevention, to turn his worst moment into his most important work. So yes, Williams paid £5,000 to have his career destroyed, but what he got in return was something no amount of money could buy. Perspective, purpose, peace. The kind of success that doesn't show up on a resume but shows up in how you treat people, how you handle adversity, how you measure your own worth. The kind of success that means when you lay your head down at night, you can actually rest because you know you're living a life that matters. And if you're wondering whether Williams would do it all again, knowing what he knows now, he'd tell you that's the wrong question. You can't undo your mistakes. You can only decide what to do with them. You can let them destroy you, or you can let them develop you. You can stay stuck in what went wrong, or you can move forward into what could go right. Williams chose forward, and that choice made every single day is what actually saved him. Before you go, I need you to do something. Type your country in the comments right now. Let me know where you're watching from. Hit that subscribe button because we share real stories like this that will change how you see success and failure. And share this video with someone who needs to hear that it's possible to come back from rock bottom. Because Williams's story proves that the end of one chapter is just the beginning of another. And sometimes the best chapters are the ones you write after everything falls apart.